Let's get to the hot takes here, Sam. The QB hot takes that are going around here.
Yeah.
I've heard it described as the wet blanket of reason. So I'm stealing that from Greg Bedard, actually, New England beat writer. Let's, cool off the hot takes. You want to set a little background here? We'll set up our friend Pete Schrager.
Yeah. We have a little video clip that's clipped from a Good Morning Football segment, our big rivals of a Monday morning.
Yeah. We beat them to the punch, though. We were 10 hours early.
It's true.
Yeah.
Where he's basically talking about Joe Burrow versus Patrick Mahomes heading into this AFC Championship game. So fire up the video.
Joe Burrow goes 4-0 against Mahomes and 1-0 against Allen. How am I saying that Joe Burrow is not the first guy in the AFC? Yeah. This game is huge. I know Mahomes' ankle is banged up. I know that the Chiefs are the 1 seed and at home. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation on Monday morning from a big picture standpoint about Joe Burrow in that AFC. Right now, it seems like it's 1, 2, 3, and Mahomes is still at the top. He's the MVP, he's the whole thing. But if Burrow beats Mahomes on Sunday, how could you make the argument that Mahomes is better than Burrow?
I hear that.
Okay. First of all, I just want to say, I like Pete Schrager.
Let's preface it.
I don't think I've ever met the guy in person, but he seems like a nice guy.
I've
I don't have any problem.
I've been on Good Morning Football.
There you go.
We talk every now and again. Yeah, I like Pete.
I don't have any problem with Pete Schrager, but I hate this line of thought, which is what everything is these days, right? We've lurched back and forth between Daniel Jones. Is he terrible? Is he great? Based off single game performances 1 week to the next. There's no analysis in there. It's just, look at the output. Was it good? Therefore, we need to say he's great. Was it bad? Therefore, we need to say he sucks. Josh Allen this year has gone from is Josh Allen MVP, the best quarterback in the NFL, to maybe Josh Allen's the problem now. Is Josh Allen good? Is he even in this conversation with really good AFC quarterbacks? And now we're reaching the stage where we're if Joe Burrow beats Patrick Mahomes, a Patrick Mahomes who is dealing with a high ankle sprain, right? To the point where he probably shouldn't be playing this week. He only is because it's the AFC Championship game. If Joe Burrow beats a hobbled Patrick Mahomes, and by beats, I mean is on a team that beats Patrick Mahomes' team, we can't say that Patrick Mahomes is better. There's no argument you can make. You cannot construct the argument that Patrick Mahomes is a better quarterback if Joe Burrow beats him whilst he's injured. What? What is that?
If it was parsed as Bengals and Chiefs, though, and if it was hey, at the end of the day here, if the Bengals win again, and they've got the Chiefs' number, and they've beaten them 4 straight times, and it's through the lens of the Bengals could be the new top dog in the AFC, I could buy into that.
But it isn't.
I know. But
even then, I'm not sure it's accurate, right? There is a world where one team can be a stylistically bad matchup for another team and be worse, right? This world of sort of styles make fights, like boxing or MMA. You can just have a guy that's a bad matchup, but you're better than he. You're in a vacuum better than this guy. You can't beat him because he's a bad matchup for you, but you'll beat everybody else. If you beat everybody else and lose to this one guy, is that guy better than you, even if he's 500 versus everybody else? No.
Yeah, look, I disagree with all of it. Yes. Re-ranking the quarterbacks based off this Sunday's outcome, even if Mahomes has a healthy ankle, I think is ridiculous.
Here's the thing.
Listen, there's a different argument to make, though, right? There's a different argument to make if you really want to rank quarterbacks and say Joe Burrow's better than Patrick Mahomes. You could look at PFF grades over the last 2 years. You could say over the last 2 years, Burrow's actually got a better track record than Patrick Mahomes in certain areas. The thing that always gives Mahomes the advantage, though, is he's been doing it for 5 years, right? There's been one little blip in Mahomes' game. There's been a blip. There was a blip in 21 last year where he wasn't as good. And they still made it to the AFC Championship, right? Yes. They still and he still played well last year and led a high-powered offense. So that's why Mahomes is sitting atop, current quarterback rankings. But this craziness goes the other way too, Sam. Nobody is immune to this. This isn't people are already saying, Mahomes is passing Brady as the best of all time, and they're in their GOAT rankings because Brady's played 23 years, but they're still looking at the most recent thing that they saw. Right? Even the perspective that in Mahomes' first 5 years, Brady and Mahomes did play in the playoff. Brady outplayed him in the playoffs twice. And while in his 40s when he should have been retired like all of his colleagues, like all of that stuff. If you're into ranking quarterbacks and ranking them all time, like all of that stuff has instantly been forgotten because Brady looks like a 45-year-old and Mahomes is the best quarterback in the league this year. Because people can only remember the last thing that they saw.
It's such a frustrating argument because, again, framing it as, I don't know how you can possibly even construct the argument that Mahomes is better than Joe Burrow if he loses to Burrow for the 4th straight time. Number one, he is not losing to Burrow. The Kansas City Chiefs are losing to the Cincinnati Bengals. There's 45 guys that play in those games for each team. We're talking 90 people, plus the impact of the coaching staff, plus the impact of like blind luck and the bounce of a ball, right? These are things that happen, and they've been 3 so far, pretty damn close games. It's not like the Bengals have blown out the Chiefs every single one of those games. And even if they had, again, I would argue that doesn't necessarily seal the deal. So that's number one. They're not simply playing head to head, right? It's a combination of their team versus the other team. Number two, Mahomes is about to win the MVP. Like, whatever, it was 49 people voted for him as first team All-Pro. I think he's basically a slam dunk to win MVP. I forget what the actual numbers are, but it was very, very heavy in Mahomes' favor, and those votes are already in, right? So just this year, 49 people, or however many it was, have determined that Mahomes is better than Joe Burrow. Like, unless you're telling me that the last 2 weeks has completely changed that opinion for everybody, then obviously you can construct the argument, because people did. People were literally tasked 2 weeks ago, which guy is better? Who is the more important quarterback? He's winning MVP. And they did, and it was Mahomes by a landslide. So, like, just this concept of, well, if this happens this week, well, that's now 4 in a row, which means it has to be him. Even though Baker Mayfield is 3-0 against Joe Burrow. Is he better? Right? Eli Manning was 2-0 against Brady in Super Bowls. Is he the better quarterback? Jake Plummer was 3-0 against Tom Brady. Is Jake Plummer a better quarterback than Tom Brady?
Pete even mentioned that, actually, in the 3-minute clip.
Right. So
Pete mentioned,
by definition, it's a ridiculous argument.
We only played the 30-second clip. He actually mentioned the Jake Plummer stat against Brady, and he also mentioned on Monday morning, from a big picture standpoint, we have to start considering Burrow as maybe the best. And I'm like, well, look, if you want to construct that argument, like I said, you can construct Burrow versus Mahomes versus Allen any way you want, right? There's data points. You could use stuff if you want. But to say that the big picture is going to change based off this very small picture, which is this Sunday,
yes,
while Mahomes has a high ankle sprain, which is a 3 to 4 week injury, that I think is off. So this isn't about Pete.
No, it's
this is about Dak Prescott this week. It's about Josh Allen this week. It's about Mahomes is the GOAT. It's about every one of those conversations. It's about watching a Sunday night football game where a quarterback who has good stats throws a touchdown and everybody's like, he's the MVP. He's got to be the MVP. I just saw this touchdown. Right. That's my MVP.
It's about one game immediately changing everything you thought you knew about whatever. It shouldn't make that kind of impact. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because what made Tom Brady was each one of these little events being stacked up on top of each other, one after another, after another, after another. Earlier in their careers, Peyton Manning was an obviously better quarterback than Tom Brady. But every one of these clutch moments, every one of these Super Bowl championships, every one of these sort of inevitable late game comebacks or drives or moments of magic that in themselves, you could always argue, like, oh, Adam Vinatieri made that one. Or, you know what I mean? Like, you can kind of tear down each one of these things. And for a while, there was some crazy debate, where like Brady is 5 plays away from having no rings, right? You're like, well, equally, he's 5 plays away from having 10 or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But each one of those, when you start stacking them upon each other, that's what creates this legacy. So it does change just getting on the right end of some of these results, right? And Burrow is starting to construct that kind of resume, albeit we're obviously way, way, way earlier in the process. But he's beaten Josh Allen, or his team. The Bengals have beaten Josh Allen and the Bills in pretty conclusive circumstances. They were on their way to doing it the first time before that game got abandoned. He's beaten Kansas City now 3 times in a row. These are the kinds of games and performances that do stack upon each other and build a legacy. But they don't happen it doesn't change. It doesn't go from 0 legacy to legacy. after one game, right? If he beats Mahomes again, it is another block. But then he's got to win a Super Bowl, and then he's got to, he needs to keep stacking them upon each other. That's what builds the legacy. One game and one performance should never completely change everything you think about a player or a team or whatever. It's just madness.
That's where I do think I'm different from most in the analytics community. That's where I do think the QB wins get you in the ballpark over time. And all of the things that you talked about, no matter, from a Brady perspective, no matter which way you parse it, when they're behind in the fourth quarter, when all the pressure's on him, or when there's no run game or whatever it is, Brady ends up finding a way to win. I do think the quarterback dictates wins more than any other position in sports, besides maybe like the NBA superstar, right, at whatever position. So it's not like just use wins, but I do think over time you have the biggest impact, and it probably gets you in the ballpark. And I think your point of Brady stacked those things up, and over time it's like, oh yeah, it didn't matter if he was in New England or Tampa Bay. It didn't matter if they were down 10. It didn't matter if he threw the ball 50 times. He's been the most successful in every potential situation. So that's kind of like what Mahomes and Burrow and all those guys are dealing with. If we're talking about just ranking quarterbacks here, you want to take in all their situation. I think the biggest feather in Mahomes' cap is losing Tyreek Hill, and still being as productive as he is. I think all of those data points matter.
The only problem I have with that logic, and I think generally you're probably right, that this idea of the best quarterbacks actually win is probably more true than people give it credit for. Like, obviously, in any small sample size, the smaller the sample size, the worse it gets, right? So you can clearly look at one game where a quarterback played out of his mind and lost because everything around him was bad. That very small correlation between good performance from the quarterback and win at the end of it. But the larger the sample you're looking at, the better a picture you probably get. But where I think it becomes very difficult is when you start looking at this sort of big picture legacy type of conversation. Like, does Dan Marino's lack of championships and success at the playoff level, does that indicate a fundamental problem in Dan Marino's game and a relative lack of greatness compared with Joe Montana or Tom Brady or Terry Bradshaw or a guy who won a lot of rings? Or does it simply mean that once you get down to the sharp end of the season, flaws in the team or differences in quality simply show up more, or the bad end of variance, which, remember, like in all these guys, the sample size we're talking about is tiny once you start getting down to this level. Like even Brady, right? 6 championships, 7? How many has he won?
7.
7 championships. The difference, again, you can take 5 of them away with 5 plays, right? So the fact that he's ended up on the right side of every one of these is probably an indication that Brady does have some kind of clutch, greatest of all time, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, it could also be that he simply got the good end of variance for that, for that small sample size. And the difference between Tom Brady and Peyton Manning, I don't want to say is luck, but is a hell of a lot closer than people want to say it to be based off the outcomes, right?
You're playing both sides here.
I'm not playing both sides as much as simply asking the question, like, this is the problem with this mode of thought, right? I agree that when we look back, when we're 25 years down the line, and we look back at the careers of Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, we're going to start looking at things like this, right? Which is Joe Burrow, had this kind of record against Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, and he had X number of championships, and Mahomes made it to the AFC title game 5 straight times, and blah, 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 right? But what I don't know is how much that's actually them driving that, and I don't know that there's an answer to that question. Obviously, you can go through play by play and you can parse it all out and you can say, wow, look at this incredible play by Mahomes or Burrow or whatever. But I do think ultimately we're probably trying to construct a pattern that might not exist and might simply be, this is a game where small sample sizes dictate outcomes, and it's not always like deserved. It's not always justified. It's just the way it went.
The PFF NFL podcast is sponsored by Western and Southern Financial Group. While you focus on your roster moves, Western and Southern helps advance your money moves. Buying your first home, planning to start a family, wondering how to make your money grow? Well, Western and Southern's playbook of life insurance, investment, and retirement solutions helps you rest assured on game day. Team up to understand needs and address goals with a game plan built just for you. Get started at westernsouthern.com/PFF. So just to pull it all together, we love Pete. We'll see him at the Super Bowl too, right? We'll say hi, Maybe they'll have us on Good Morning Football to
Probably
discuss.
not after this.
Maybe not. I'm the tallest guest they've ever had. Pete tried to say,
Is that official?
yeah, well, he tried to say it was Dan McGuire.
Yeah.
But if you go to Pro Football Reference and you go to Pro Baseball Reference,
Yeah.
you'll get your answer.
Will it
Dan is merely 6'8".
Will it be the correct answer, though?
Yeah. I mean, I may have shrunk since being listed at 6'10". Maybe I'm Dan McGuire's size now.
Did you shrink or did you just have a bad listing?
I'm 6'10". 6'10" in your program.
I will say it benefits me to have you listed as 6'10" because it helps the argument that I'm not a munchkin.
Yeah.
You know?
I make you look small.
Yeah.
People think you're 5'8".
I know.
Tops. So, to Pete's defense,
he's not the problem here.
No,
He is simply a
it's not about him.
symptom
Yeah.
of this wider rot.
And
that
we've been in it,
exists
man.
in the narrative world.
We've had people tell us, be bold. Have strong takes.
Yeah.
And I don't. I sit on the fence. I sit right there on the fence.
But I think, isn't there that, is it a data, I forget sort of where this phrase comes from, but have strong takes held weekly.
Yeah,
And by weekly, I mean...
with an A, not every single week.
Yes, exactly.
There are some people who have strong takes and they hold them weekly, as in 7 days at a time.
True.
Right?
Very true. Well, that's
like a week ago, Josh Allen
that's
is
different. That's
the
exactly
best.
that's what we're talking about here, right? The exact same sentence applies, but what we need you to do is to change the E to an A.
Yeah, so
and then everything
weekly
is fine.
is greater than weekly, as in 7 days.
Have
Weekly
strong
with an A.
takes
Yeah.
held with weakness, not have strong takes that change on a weekly basis.
So what happened was somebody heard this and was like, "You're right. I'm going to have a different take every week." Because last week, Josh Allen was probably the best quarterback of all time or something like that,
Just a few weeks ago.
Also, not everything has to be the best or worst. Like a year ago at this time, Matthew Stafford won the Super Bowl and we had to discuss his Hall of Fame credentials. And it's like, I don't think it changed in a month. I don't think it did. I don't think his Hall of Fame credentials changed in a month. Now, if you add another month to that after another really good season with the Rams, maybe it could. If Stafford goes out and has another great year like he did in 21 and they win the Super Bowl next year, maybe it does. But that doesn't change in a month.
Yeah, the Stafford thing is a fascinating example because did the run that he had in the playoffs fundamentally change anything about Matthew Stafford's career? Did Joe Flacco's run to a Super Bowl change Joe Flacco's career? And then you can sort of go a little bit further, like Eli Manning's runs for the Super Bowl. I think they changed legacies, but I don't think they should dramatically change what you're talking about for each one of those players. Like Joe Flacco was not a particularly good NFL quarterback relative to Tom Brady and legit GOATs and championship caliber guys. He got really hot for a 5-game stretch and it ended up winning Baltimore Super Bowl. Eli Manning had 2 really impressive postseason runs in an otherwise pretty average NFL starting career. Matthew Stafford, I think, was way more volatile throughout his NFL career and then caught fire in the playoffs on a much better team generally than his Detroit teams and won a championship. But we shouldn't immediately then go, oh, all of a sudden Matthew Stafford's one of the greatest of all time. Now, look, you can add, now, because he's won a championship, we can look at his passing yardage totals are going to be better than Peyton Manning's.
No, we like them.
Right,
now,
now it means something. It didn't a week ago, but now that he beat the Bengals because Aaron Donald just made 3 consecutive plays at the end of the game, now we can start talking about him in a completely different light. What?
I also think there's a difference between looking back and assigning credit versus what's going to happen going forward. So if Burrow and the Bengals do beat Mahomes this weekend, I do believe in the legacy stuff. I do think it matters, right? I mean, Mahomes...
Well, it's the only way you can judge them at the end of the day, right? So it has to.
But right or wrong, Mahomes, people want to put him up with Montana, Peyton, and Brady. And maybe he gets there over time. This weekend matters a lot for that, right? Because they're going to say, how did you go to X number of Super Bowls? Did you win them and this and that? So I looking back, it probably matters. But if we're going to define, if Burrow and the Bengals win and we're saying next year, which quarterback do you want? I mean, it still probably is Mahomes. It's still probably Mahomes right now for the foreseeable future. Again, I think there was a blip last year where he wasn't playing as well and he wasn't able to adjust, right? But that's how good he's been, is that there was a half-year blip, and that's what we're talking about.
And his blip was 4,800 passing yards, 37 touchdowns, and 13 picks. His blip is a career year for most quarterbacks.
Yeah. So anyway, does anyone in the chat have anything to add to this? Have we covered this? I mean, the Dak thing is the same thing. If you want to go back and say Dak's legacy with the Cowboys, I mean, it does, like last week hurts it. I don't care, no matter how bad people think the scheme was, the Niners defense is tough. Dak played horribly in a game, and he didn't play well last year against the Niners in the playoffs in games where the Cowboys had a good team, right? They had a good shot to go on a run, right? I think it does hurt Dak's legacy. Does that mean, but then there's a lot of other data points that say Dak's a top 8 quarterback. And we talk all the time about you probably want a top 8 quarterback to give yourself a shot. So does how Dak Prescott played last week have any bearing on how he'll do in, say, the divisional round next year, if given the opportunity? I don't think so. I don't think you go into the divisional round next year and be like, well, Dak's a choker. Had a 38 grade last year against the Niners. There's no way he'll do it. He could have a good game. He could lead a Super Bowl run next year for the Cowboys. So that's the difference, right? I do think looking back, you could say, yeah, Dak Prescott has underperformed in some key playoff games, and that does matter in the grand scheme of how good do you think he's been for the Cowboys. I don't know if it affects the next game that he plays in the playoffs.
But the other sort of irritating factor about this is I do think that there are players that overall are sort of prone to choking in big moments or clutch. Like I think both choking and clutch are things. They're not, those exist. There are players with the tendency to choke, and there are players with the tendency to come up big in clutch moments. But we lose all that. Like we lose the ability to identify that because of this week-to-week push to label everything either choking or clutch, right? But regardless of what actually creates that. Like we just go, oh, this guy's a choker. I've seen 2 consecutive bad outcomes of what he's done. Therefore, like that's who he is, right? Well, doing that just muddies this picture, and you lose sight of anybody who that's actually a thing for. Like it's not analysis, it's bullshit.